Hello, I'm Tania Burchardt. I'm an Associate Director at the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I'm delighted to be recording this presentation for you for the conference on Towards a Family-Friendly Tea Industry. My title is A Multidimensional Equality Measurement Framework for Children. And you might be forgiven for thinking that we really have quite enough measurement frameworks as it is, whether that's from the Sustainable Development Goals, from UNICEF, from the International Labour Organization, from your own mother and child-friendly seal for responsible business, or indeed the Equality and Human Rights Commission here in the UK, which I've done some work for, looking at a children's measurement framework. So in order to try and answer that challenge, I'm going to briefly take you through some thoughts on why it is important to monitor children's outcomes, what we might consider monitoring, then the specific example of the equality measurement framework for children that I've been involved in developing, and some of the challenges and I hope the potentials for measurement frameworks of this kind. The first question then is, why bother to monitor at all? And I think the most straightforward answer to that challenge is that what gets measured gets done. We've seen this time and again in public policy, that where something is going beneath the radar, where there are not data to understand a problem, it doesn't feature on the policymakers' radar. It doesn't get seen. So providing objective, independent, reliable evidence on outcomes for children and families is a crucial first step to getting some progress in improving their lives and livelihoods. It's also important, I think, in order to evaluate change over time. So when we want to assess the effectiveness of existing policies and practices, or whether there are new initiatives, and we want to investigate the effectiveness of those new initiatives and their implementation, having a baseline against which to compare is crucial. This kind of monitoring exercise can also help to highlight specific areas for action, informing communities themselves, employers, NGOs, local authorities, central government, even international bodies, about where the problems lie and which specific issues should be tackled first. Can also serve to highlight where we don't know, where there are data gaps. And in highlighting that, it can in turn prompt improvements in data collection. A further reason is more public facing, and that is to raise the profile of equality and human rights in the public and political agenda by building up public knowledge and understanding about rights, about social justice and equality issues. Attitudinal change can be gradually brought about. And finally, I think these kinds of monitoring exercises can be extremely important in demonstrating good practice and embedding a culture of equality and human rights protection, not only in the particular sector in which you're working, but more broadly as an exemplar. So if you're persuaded that monitoring itself is a good idea, what should it be that we monitor? Well, I want to characterize there as being two traditions here which feed into the approach that we've used for the equality measurement framework here in the UK. And these two traditions are the human rights tradition and the equalities tradition. So according to the human rights tradition, you start from legal standards, whether that's in national law or in international law, and you derive those areas of human life that should be protected, safeguarded, promoted, and monitor accordingly. And the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has produced some good practice guidelines for monitoring human rights. I'm going to skip, for reasons of time, the lessons, I think, from that monitoring, and instead introduce you to the other main tradition, which I think feeds into effective monitoring, which comes more from a social justice perspective, not restricted to legally encoded rights, looking across multiple dimensions simultaneously, such as health, standard of living, participation, and so on, and strongly based in analysis of different identities, different characteristics, such as sex and ethnicity, and of course, increasingly also looking at intersections between those, for example, women from particular ethnic minorities, and so on. Putting these two traditions together, we come to the capability approach. Some of you may have come across the work of Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winner, who created the capability approach, drawing on both the equalities and the human rights traditions, amongst other things. According to the capability approach, the objective that we should focus on in terms of monitoring and evaluation is the extent to which people have real freedoms to lead the lives that they value. And this can be expressed as whether they have the opportunity to flourish, to have a wide range of capabilities, and draws our attention to those things that people are enabled to be and do in their lives. But what they're enabled to be and do in turn depends on not only their own characteristics, but also the people around them, the resources and services that they can draw on, the rights they can access, and the institutions such as employers' support, structures and legal frameworks of society that ground their possibilities. And in particular, within the capability approach, we can see that childhood is a critical period of capability formation. So childhood matters not only in its own right, but also because it's the time of life when future adult life is shaped and determined. So the equality measurement framework then that we've developed in the UK is grounded in the capability approach. So it starts from that core concept of potential inequalities in real freedoms, in the important things that people are able to be and do in their lives. And that's then unpacked by looking at three different aspects of that real freedom: the outcomes that people can achieve, the extent to which they're treated with dignity on the one hand, or discriminated against on the other, and thirdly, the degree to which they have a role in the decision-making about important aspects of their lives, the extent to which they have autonomy. And we can look at those three aspects across 10 central domains of life: life itself, physical security, health, education, standard of living, productive and valued activities, that includes employment, for example, but also unpaid work, participation, influence, and voice in political processes, in your community, in your workplace, individual, family, and social life, identity, expression, and self-respect, and legal security. And within and across those domains, we need to look at individuals with different characteristics by sex, ethnicity, disability, and so on. And finally, to think about what are the enablers and the constraints of those capabilities across the domains. What resources, practices, policies, institutions either support or interfere with people's flourishing across these 10 core aspects of life. Applying that specifically to children can give you an example here of one domain specification for children under this framework, looking in at physical security. So here we might think about what the core elements of physical security for children might look like. It might include being free from violence, including sexual and domestic violence, being free from cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, being protected from physical or mental harm by adults, especially those in positions of authority like teachers, and being protected from other children as well in the form of bullying potentially, but also positively that they should be able to go out and use public spaces safely and securely and without fear. Now, these are just examples, but as you can probably see, they're derived in part from scrutiny of human rights instruments. Some of those phrases will be familiar to you, but also from consultation with children and children's organisations in the UK to discover what's important to them and what they would want to see characterised as important protections for a flourishing life. So we can then ask questions, having identified which aspects of physical security are important. We can then ask questions about what the outcomes are for children, whether children in these respects are treated with dignity or discriminated against, and the extent to which children are involved in decisions that affect them in relation to physical security. And we can ask questions about inequalities in these outcomes and in the way that people are treated. Do boys or girls fare better? What about children of different ages, children from different ethnic groups? Are there particular groups of children who seem to be vulnerable in this respect? And then finally, we can ask what helps and what interferes. What laws and regulations protect children from harm? How are those regulations enforced? Who can children turn to if something goes wrong? And what facilities and services are available to children to support their physical security? Another example here of productive and valued activities. Under this, we might think about the importance of children having safe, enjoyable and developmental play, having leisure time, rest time, including time with their families, being protected from performing work which interferes with their education or development. And if, as an older child, as a teenager, they do undertake some paid work, which can be important developmentally, of course, that they should do so in just and favourable conditions, including, of course, health and safety. And again, we can ask about the three different aspects of equality, and we can talk about who does well, who does badly amongst different children, and we can ask what policies, resources, facilities, services support or interfere. Here, in particular, in relation to productive and valued activities, we can see that there's an interaction between children's circumstances and their parents. So if the family income is too low, children may be encouraged or required to work for pay at a young age. So understanding the child in the context of the family is particularly important here. So this kind of approach has been used and applied in the UK by a number of different organisations, including the official Human Rights Monitoring Organisation, but also by government agencies, by local governments, by the Children's Commissioner, and indeed by advocacy groups and NGOs as well. There are lots of challenges in using a framework of this kind. Challenges of communication with children about what the framework might mean, and of course between different stakeholders, employers, local government, NGOs, and so on. You just have to keep talking. This is our experience. We've been at it a long time, and eventually there comes to be more of a common ground, more of a common view. And in creating the framework, it's of course crucial to involve as many people, as many stakeholders as possible in the design of that framework itself. Co-production is key. The data are challenging. There are lots of missing values. There's lots that we don't know that we would like to know. It can feel like an empty framework. But again, we found that existing sources can often be used creatively, don't necessarily have to reach only for survey data, but using insights from interviews can also be important, or case studies. And the framework itself can prompt improvements in data collection over time. It can also seem overwhelmingly complex, especially at first encounter. There are just too many different frameworks, too many domains, too many indicators. It can all feel a bit too much. But of course, you don't have to do everything all at once. So being selective, looking for a particular spotlight or theme and homing in on that can be a very effective way to work. But in doing that more focused work, it can also be useful to be able to situate it within a broader and more comprehensive framework. Then there's the challenge of change over time. Nothing stays the same. A pandemic comes along, or a cost of living crisis, fuel prices, food prices, whatever it is. So the indicators often need updating, either the data themselves or what it is you're measuring, in changing with in common with that changing context. So it's important not to set a framework in stone, but to build in review procedures from the outset. So to wrap up, I've suggested that equality and human rights traditions give rise to the capability approach, which focuses on the idea of what people are able to be and do that is really important to them. Childhood here is crucial not only for its own sake, for the sake of children's lives, but also as a foundation for adult life and creating the capabilities for a really flourishing life thereafter. I've outlined the children's measurement framework with 10 multidimensional domains, 3 aspects of equality, looking at outcomes, looking at how people are treated, and looking at the degree to which they have a say over important aspects of their lives. And I've stressed the importance of thinking about differences between sexes, between ages, different ethnic groups, disabled and non-disabled, and other groups that may be important in the particular context that you're considering. The framework also encourages us to think about enablers and constraints in terms of the resources, services, policies, practices that people have available to them. And because one of the functions of a monitoring framework of this kind can be to prompt improvements in data collection, I think it's crucial that the framework is not itself initially designed around what data is currently available. It's fine to have gaps. They will be filled over time. And finally, to underline that not all indicators have to be statistical. So using testimony of individuals, children themselves, or cases perhaps that NGOs have come across can be more powerful in combination with statistics than either statistics or testimony alone. I hope that's been interesting for you. Be very happy to continue the conversation. Please do contact me or follow up on the website at the resources placed here. Thanks very much.